He gently lowers her onto the bed and positions himself on top of her. Before proceeding, the prince thinks about what to do next, considering that maybe some foreplay might be a good idea. But then he realizes he's got no real experience with it, having only ever seen a few of those racy magazines. So the prince decides to try a different approach. Maybe some smooth talking or cheeky banter will help set the mood before they dive into the main event. Just as he's trying to figure out what to say, Anna takes the initiative. She gently pushes him onto the bed and gets on top of him. He places his hands on her thighs, and she recalls the moment when he pushed her away and took that javelin in his shoulder, and asks if he didn't consider his own life at that moment. The prince responds that it was instinctive. Anna then reminds him that he's the future ruler of Grey Castle and the hope of all witches, implying that her own life doesn't matter as much in comparison. The prince insists that it wasn't about worth. He simply couldn't stand to see her die, and if he had more time to think about it, he'd still trade his life for hers without a second thought. As they lie there, Anna asks the prince to tell her more stories from his past, because she wants to know everything about him. The prince starts narrating, explaining that he used to live in a massive city, much bigger than Border Town. Roland then reveals that while he wasn't exactly exceptional, he was a bit smarter than average. He worked hard, so his teachers often praised him. But what they didn't know was that he was the one who kept drawing graffiti on the walls. Anna giggles, asking if that ever got him into trouble. In response, the prince explains that the teacher would just call his parents. His teachers kept changing as he got older, and he finished his studies with pretty typical scores, so he was always just a step behind the smartest kids. As Roland shares his story, Anna drifts off to sleep, and he realizes that she was just too exhausted to do anything more. Well, this much is not surprising, considering she was on high alert during the balloon ride back, keeping an eye out for devils or demons, and then she stayed by his side once they returned to the castle, which left the poor girl completely wiped out. Roland feels a bit bummed that they had to go through all that, but he's also relieved. At least they've got plenty of time ahead to figure out how to deal with these monstrous threats. The next day arrives with a fresh start. The first thing we see is Sylvie stretching heartily after what must have been a long, satisfying sleep. She greets Wendy with a cheerful good morning, and can't help but ask why Wendy's up so early. Wendy, with a hint of a smile, replies that she's getting older and doesn't need as much sleep anymore. Meanwhile, Nightingale, still in her nightdress, shamelessly mentions that she might need another nap later to recharge fully. Wendy asks Nightingale if she didn't sleep well, and Nightingale just says she had way too many dreams. Sylvie looks like she's about to spill something juicy about what Nightingale was doing last night, but she quickly goes silent when Nightingale shoots her a death glare. Wendy's curiosity gets the better of her, so she nudges Sylvie to keep talking, but poor Sylvie quickly backtracks and says Nightingale's sleep issues are probably just because she's been pushing herself too hard. Nightingale nods in agreement, saying her body can only handle so much. As Nightingale asks Wendy for help adjusting her bra, Sylvie reflects on how scary Prince Roland might be in some ways, but she finds him undeniably admirable. It's rare to see someone of his status who would go so far as to injure himself for a witch. There's no other explanation for his actions, as he truly stands with the witches, just like Miss Tilly. She is just overjoyed at the thought of Roland's dedication, and is thrilled that Princess Tilly has such a wonderful brother. Later, in the backyard, everyone gathers around to check out Maggie's new demonic bird form. They're all fascinated by her transformation and closely observe the changes. Sister Leaf is particularly amazed at the thought that these are the same kinds of flying monsters the devils were riding. She's relieved she didn't have to face any of these creatures herself in the Badlands, or she might not have made it out alive. Nightingale also acknowledges that their survival through the mountains was thanks to Maggie's evolved abilities. So, she turns to Maggie and promises her a bag of smoked fish every day, along with some extra honey, as a token of thanks for saving everyone's lives. When the prince hears Nightingale's plan to bring smoked fish to Maggie every day, he's in a bit of a tizzy. Those fish are meant for him, and he's not too thrilled about her taking them from the castle kitchen. Nonetheless, he approaches her and asks for a ride. Maggie takes off, soaring across the sea with both the prince and Nightingale on her back. The prince is having the time of his life because it's probably the closest he'll ever get to riding a dragon. He notices that she can fly at about 80 kilometers per hour with 2 passengers, which is slower than Lightning, but Maggie has the upper hand in stamina. Whenever Lightning needs to carry anything, she has to use more magic, and she loses altitude too. But Maggie just needs to transform, and altitude isn't a big factor in her magic consumption, and she only has to worry about her own strength. Nightingale also notes that Maggie's magic has grown tremendously, and she could easily become a powerhouse in the current witch union. She also estimates that Maggie can now transform 7 or 8 times a day with her current mana. The prince then decides it's time to drop down, and Maggie quickly begins her descent. As they get to lower altitude, the prince reveals that the building they're seeing currently is Witch Tower. We can also see all the witches standing on the balconies, and the prince points out that everyone has already picked their rooms. He tells Maggie that he knows she likes to sleep with lightning, but he's still assigned her a bedroom, and she's free to decorate it however she wants. Our little demonic bird gets excited about this news and decides to make a beeline for her new room. Maggie's excited and rapid ascent starts scaring the prince half to death, so he quickly tells her to simmer down before they end up in the clouds. Meanwhile, we also see Evelyn is on the balcony, and she looks absolutely blown away by Maggie's new transformation. Suddenly, her mind then begins to drift back into past memory, where she saw how they poured the concrete into the building's frame. She finds it fascinating that if they mix it with pebbles, they could mold it into any shape or form, making concrete a versatile building material. Evelyn then walks inside her room and sits quietly, reflecting on how it's been a month since she arrived here. She doesn't feel like she's done much besides tasting wine for the prince. Even though he gave her her own room, she's starting to feel like she doesn't deserve all this, given how little she's contributed. She lays back on her bed like a lifeless body, reflecting on how she only got 5 points in the last exam. Miss Scroll didn't make everyone's scores public, but Evelyn found out after asking around. And now, she's feeling the weight of not measuring up. Evelyn thinks to herself how she's been practicing her handwriting every day after class, even getting help from Lily and Moon. Despite her efforts, she feels like she's just an average idiot with peanuts for brains. Suddenly, she hears her fellow witch, Candle, who excitedly bursts in to explain that the living room has an actual kitchen and even a weird room painted white, and she tells her friend to come with her to see it. But Evelyn looks too dejected to pay any attention to what her friend is saying. Candle notices her mood and gets worried, asking if she's feeling okay, and wonders if Evelyn is upset about having to sleep alone now. That's when Evelyn finally speaks up, reminding her friend that they've been living here for a month. In response, the little one agrees, but she is not sure what Evelyn is trying to say exactly. Evelyn goes on to remind her little friend about how Lotus is almost done with the new wall she was helping to prepare. Honey has been training a bunch of messenger birds, and Sylvie went with the prince to investigate the monsters. But on the other hand, she feels like she herself hasn't had anything to do, doesn't even have anything to practice, and has the worst test scores. All of this is making her wonder why the prince chose someone useless like her. After hearing all of this, Candle suggests her friend to ask Prince Roland directly about it. Evelyn is startled by this suggestion, but Candle reassures her that the prince is Miss Tilly's brother and has genuine intentions for the witches. She mentions that even Sylvie, who was once very critical of him, has softened and even complimented him once or twice yesterday. So, she encourages her to talk to the prince, assuring her that he won't be harsh or chew her out for speaking with him personally. Eventually, Evelyn decides to go talk to Prince Roland. We are back in the castle, where we see the old man Barov, asking the prince why he's specifically recruiting women for the starch production. In response, Roland explains that women are generally more careful and that he wants more women working instead of staying at home. He also tells Barov that once the next exam ends, he will be in charge of recruiting female apprentices for the city hall. Barov is surprised to hear this, and points out there is no example of women as labor in the past, and further highlights that the other apprentices are just as careful as well. The prince explains that if there's no existing model, they'll have to create one, because adding women to the workforce is the easiest way to expand the labor force. The prince also assigns Barov the task of changing people's attitudes about women working. Besides, he points out that given the fat paycheck every woman is going to receive, he is sure that they'll gradually step up to the job. Suddenly, Nightingale pops back into the office and asks the prince if this starch stuff is something delicious he's planning to make. The prince shakes his head with no and says it's not just food, but it does have a pretty neat byproduct. He explains that if you mix wheat flour with water and knead it until the water turns completely white, then replace the water, you're left with a sticky ball of gluten. This gluten can be deep-fried or stir-fried, making it soft and bouncy, and then you can glaze it with honey or mix it with spices. All of that sounds delicious, and it seems like Nightingale has already started drooling just hearing about it. The prince decides it's probably best to stop talking before she gets even more excited. In his head, the prince thinks about how processed flour water becomes starch, which is a crucial ingredient in explosives. Since he hasn't started producing glycerin yet, TNT is off the table for now. But starch is the easiest explosive to manufacture, and it's not very sensitive, so it can't be ignited by fire and needs a detonator, but it's actually stronger than TNT. The prince is confident that once his alchemists manage to create TNT, he'll be one step closer to shaking Timothy's throne. While the prince is dreaming of the grand explosions he'll be able to create with starch, Nightingale is also drooling over the thought of fried and roasted gluten once starch production begins. Both of them are lost in their thoughts, having the time of their lives thinking about their interests, when suddenly Evelyn opens the office door anxiously and walks in. Nightingale quickly disappears, and the prince asks Evelyn the reason for her visit. The girl nervously responds that she has a question to ask. The prince assumes she might bring up the same old question about why he tolerates witches, but he brushes off the thought and happily encourages her to ask. Evelyn stammers out of nervousness and asks why he picked her for the position, since her abilities aren't as useful as Sylvie's, and she's nowhere close to Lotus or Honey. She mentions that if he just wanted someone to taste different wines and alcohol, he could have easily hired a connoisseur. The prince quickly figures out what Evelyn's thinking and asks her how she feels about the alcohol he's given her. Evelyn is a bit puzzled at first, but mentions that while it was too strong at first, she's gotten used to it. The prince then rummages through the bookshelf and pulls out a bottle of alcohol. Evelyn further continues and adds that the cocktails with ice, juice, and sugar were really delicious. But she also points out that her family's pub only sold cheap wine and crude beer, so she doesn't really know what the wealthy prefer. After pouring the beer into a glass, the prince asks if she can transform it into vodka. Evelyn agrees and quickly uses her abilities on the liquid. As expected, the color of the beer starts to change, and the prince takes a quick taste and confirms that this is exactly what he was looking for, which is precisely why he hired her. The prince mentions he's planning to open an ethanol factory, but quickly corrects himself, saying instead he's opening a brewery and Evelyn will be the professional winemaker. Well, Evelyn looks unsure about her abilities and remains silent. Meanwhile, back with Garcia Wimbledon, a man arrives in her chamber asking for her help and justice. He explains that his territory has not been fully attacked by heretics yet, but his son died in the hands of their followers while he was protecting the previous queen, and now the rebels are hiding in the mountains. He wants revenge and asks Garcia for alchemy products that can blow open city gates. He promises that if she helps him out, he'll fully support her, and the entire Silver Heron family will follow her as well. Garcia smirks while thinking to herself that Duke Bode is quite influential. If she appoints him as the prime minister and unifies the remaining elites, it'll make her accusation of betrayal much easier. She quickly decides to help him, saying she likes the proposal, but can't just hand everything over. She assures him that she'll have alchemists assist him when needed. The Duke is pleased by her generosity and walks off happily. Soon after, Garcia's knight appears with a glass of beer and offers it to her. He notes that with all the elites in her palm, she could dominate the entire kingdom even without the Wolfheart King's help. Garcia agrees, and just then, the knight presents a letter from the Wolfheart King. She opens it quickly, and the knight anxiously asks if it's bad news. Garcia reads the letter and grimly states that the church has sent more troops. They're coming for Wolfheart City, and they've breached many perimeters. The knight is stunned by the news and quickly asks why the church is launching an attack even though the months of demons are almost upon them. Garcia is also startled to hear this news, noting that she didn't expect the church to act so quickly. If they had waited until next spring, she would have been better prepared. Now, they're not giving her a chance to recover, and if she ignores the Wolfheart King's call for help, they'll destroy him. This means she won't be able to hold them off for long either. However, Garcia sees this as a good opportunity. If many of the church's troops are defeated at Wolfheart and demons swarm Hermes in the Holy City, it could spell the end of the church. She tells her knight to mobilize the Black Flag soldiers because this year they'll be spending the winter at Wolfheart. Back in Border Town, we see an air balloon up in the sky. On the ground, Carter is blown away by the news that the prince is about to bomb the capital with hot air balloons from 2,000 meters. While observing the balloon through binoculars, the prince says that as long as they manage the targeting, it's totally doable. He notes that Theo's letter mentioned Timothy is forcing more people to join his forces, so he is probably using the same strategy of using Church's pills. Iron Axe excitedly agrees, adding that as long as they blow Timothy's head by nuking the shit out of him, he is definitely going to get screwed for sure. The prince is hoping for just that and mentions he's been testing bombs for a week, so fingers crossed it works. Meanwhile, Carter can be seen crying, and he is yapping about how perimeters and defenses are useless against this balloon, and all their military tactics go out the window when tons of bombs are raining from the sky. When the bomb finally drops and detonates, it covers a massive area with a cloud of fire upon impact. The prince and his subordinates are practically dancing with joy, thrilled to see it worked so well. The prince then happily reveals to us that this successful test means Operation Eastern Wind 001 is all set to roll. It looks like the next episode is going to be packed with explosions. Drop a comment about what part of the video you enjoyed the most. As for me, I'm totally pumped to learn more about these devils and their origin, and I can't wait to see how the prince plans to fight them. I'm kind of hoping he considers dropping one of these on that devil's village too. In the previous episode, once Prince Roland's nuke drop from the sky was successful, he confidently declared that Operation Eastern Wind 001 is ready. Later, he gathers all the witches in the hall, and, after laying out a map of the entire territory, announces that Eastern Wind 001 will commence the next day, and that everyone present will be participating. He then turns to Iron Axe and assigns him the task of taking 50 men to escort the witches to the outskirts of Silver City. He explains that there is a mountainous area there, hidden from view, which is perfect for setting up camp and launching the hot air balloon. Iron Axe quickly agrees to take command, while Wendy asks the prince if they are not flying from the border town. The prince replies that covering such a long distance with the balloon would not be feasible. He then points to the map, which I can't quite understand since the markers aren't in English, but he explains that if they set off from Silver City, they can cover the entire distance in one day and even return by sundown. He then turns to the other witches and calls out the names of witches involved in this mission. The names are as follows: Anna, Wendy, Lightning, Maggie, Nightingale, and Sylvie, who will be participating in the mission. He assigns Nightingale and Sylvie the task of monitoring the camp, while the attack will be conducted by the other 4 witches. The prince further tells them that Lightning will be key to the operation, so she better prepare herself as well. Our adventurous girl quickly flashes a big grin, assuring the prince not to worry about the task. Lastly, the prince wraps up the conference by asking everyone to be mindful of their safety and mentioning that he will be eagerly waiting for good news from the border town. Although I'm not 100% sure what exactly Operation Eastern Wind 001 entails, as far as I remember, the prince wants to give Timothy a real shakeup, so he thinks twice about attacking the border town before the months of demons hit, because the town needs to get ready for the winter. The scene then transitions to a ship cruising down the river. Inside the boat, we spot Lady May, making her way back to the border town after quite some time. As she gazes out, she notices the witches' ship sailing towards Silver City for Operation Eastern Wind. Though Lady May has no clue where exactly the witches are headed, she wonders if they're on their way to Willowtown or perhaps Silver City. While she's thinking this, a swarm of enthusiastic little girls suddenly surrounds her, eager to chat with Miss May. Just then, Miss Eileen apologizes to Lady May, explaining that she couldn't answer all the kids' questions, so she sent them over to her. Of course, May looks a bit annoyed by the swarm of little girls, but their excitement is hard to ignore. They eagerly ask her if Prince Roland really wrote the play just for her. Despite her irritation, May smiles and happily sets the record straight, telling them that Prince Roland didn't write the play for her. It was actually Sister Scroll, the director of education in the border town, who wrote it for all the witches. One of the little girls then asks why Bella got in trouble for insulting the play if Prince Roland didn't write it. May explains that while Prince Roland didn't write the script, he did approve it and arranged everything for the performance. So, when Bella insulted the play, she was, in fact, insulting Prince Roland. But then the girls start asking some unsettling questions, revealing that they've heard Prince Roland has royal gray hair and is really handsome. Some even add that he's a bit of a playboy who loves having girls around him. Miss Eileen, clearly not thrilled with the direction the questions are taking, tells them to stop. She reminds them that they're almost at the border town, so they better start getting their luggage ready. Once the girls disperse, Miss Eileen thanks May for helping her bring the kids to the border town, even though their theater lessons aren't finished. May brushes it off, saying it's no big deal. However, Miss Eileen then points out that these kids are still just hatchlings. Even though the prince isn't expecting any hardcore stage actresses, she's concerned that they're too young for the acting gig. May then reassures her friend that she's not planning for the kids to start acting right away. She explains that while they may be far from the stage, they can read the scripts, and that's a valuable skill. And the prince always favors and accepts literate people. He uses these performances to express his views and change public opinion, rather than actually enjoying watching them. Well, this is something we all knew from the beginning. The prince uses these plays to challenge people's perceptions about witches and break down other stereotypes in this primitive society. Eileen is filled with admiration and starts clinging to her friend because she finds May's knowledge and insights truly impressive. As the ship nears the dock, they see a crowd waiting for them, and among them is Eileen's husband, Ferlin. As soon as the ship hits the dock, Eileen rushes to her husband and hugs him tightly. The other little girls disembarking also can't help but notice how handsome Ferlin looks. However, Miss May's lover, our knight Carter, is nowhere to be seen. Ferlin turns to May and thanks her for helping Eileen during the incident with Miss Bella, who had been berating everyone and insulting the prince. May quickly waves off the thanks. Ferlin then playfully teases his wife, saying she would have been in tears if May hadn't been there to put a stop to Bella, so he is glad that nothing worse happened. It's clear the couple gets along well, and seeing them in such a playful state makes May crack a smile. But despite her grin, there's an undoubtable hint of sadness lingering on her face. Later, May heads home, her mind consumed with thoughts of Carter. She's wondering why he isn't here, especially since his letter promised that he will give her a surprise when she gets back to the border town. It stings her a bit that he didn't even show up to help with her luggage, let alone throwing a party for her. She figures he must be tied up with his knightly duties for the prince. Just then, as if on cue, Knight Carter bursts onto the scene, looking utterly exhausted, and he calls out to May as he rushes over. Hearing his voice, May turns with a mix of dissatisfaction and curiosity. Carter quickly explains that he just heard the ship from Long Song Fortress had arrived and hurried from the barracks as fast as he could. And he also tries to explain himself like a typical husband, saying he didn't realize she'd be arriving this early. Noticing her heavy luggage, he also gets a bit frantic, realizing she must be worn out from hauling it all. But as he looks at her, May's face lights up with a genuine smile. It's clear that any tiredness she felt evaporates the moment she sees Carter. May offers Carter a drink, but he says he still has duties to fulfill. Then, he starts blushing as he pulls out a little box, explaining that he's here to give her a small present. Naturally, May's curiosity piques, and she wonders if it's a new product that just hit the market. But, as it turns out, there's a diamond ring inside the box. Carter gets down on one knee, takes her hand, and asks if she will marry him. May is utterly taken aback, and the unexpected proposal leaves her in a state of delightful shock. The next day, Carter is in Roland's office, and he's so over-the-top happy it's actually starting to creep the prince out. Nevertheless, the prince dives back into his office duties. As he reads through a report, he reveals that with the help of witches from Slumber Island, the border town's construction projects are progressing at breakneck speed. The steel bridge over the Redwater River is finished, aligned perfectly with the new wall, and all the credit goes to Sister Lotus and Carl, who is also the head of the construction department. After working with Lotus for a while, he is really eagerly waiting for Lotus to join the department and work with him. The prince's streak of good news continues when the mad scientist bursts into the room, looking just as pleased as Carter. It's clear he's here with good news, otherwise, he wouldn't waste his time coming here. The mad scientist quickly reveals that he has finally found the way to produce acid at a huge scale. The prince is totally boggled by the news and tells Kyle Sichi to take him to the labs. A short while later, we find ourselves at the Riverside Laboratories. Charles, the assistant to Sichi, bows and pays his respects to the prince, and it doesn't take Roland long to figure out that Charles is the same person he's heard so much about from Mr. Kyle. After exchanging pleasantries, the prince shifts his focus to the big containers lined up in the background, and quickly asks Charles how these contraptions are used to produce acid. Kyle Sichi explains that it's all based on the reaction equations they learned in Chemistry 101. He details how, once the acid is isolated, it's burned in the furnace. The resulting gas is then heated and stored in a lead container. The prince is fascinated and asks again if all these containers are indeed made of lead. Kyle Sitchy nods and explains that lead is the only material that can handle the acid's corrosive power. The lead pipes at the top pump nitric acid into the system. Under carbon dioxide's influence, the nitric acid breaks down into nitrogen oxides. These oxides mix with water and carbon dioxide to create an acidic mix that flows out from the bottom hole. He says this reaction is great because the nitrogen oxides just deliver oxygen without consuming anything. So you don't need a lot of nitric acid to keep it going. The prince then asks about how much acid they can produce. Charles explains that with this setup, they can make about a week's worth of acid in a single day. It's just a prototype right now, but if they build bigger ones, they could produce even more. Roland is really satisfied with the info and states that once Anna gets back from Silver City, they'll work on larger production units. He also mentions that if they run out of lead, they can use metal instead, since Miss Soraya's paint can handle corrosion. That's when Kyle Sitchy finally gets up the nerve to make his long-awaited request. He asks the prince if he can be granted Chemistry 201. After all, he has fulfilled his promise, and all 5 of their labs are now brimming with apprentices thanks to their success in acid manufacturing. A bit later, the prince is hunched over in his office, while Lady Scroll is busy arranging books. The prince is deep into trying to remember his physics and chemistry knowledge, but it's clear he's having a rough time. Lady Scroll can hear him mumbling to himself, and though she wants to help, she can only jot down whatever the prince tells her. She admits that this stuff is way more complex than the math and natural sciences she's used to, and it's no wonder he's struggling. She then walks over to him, tells him to take a break. The prince, however, expresses how envious he is of her memorization skills. He jokes that if he were like her, he wouldn't have to stress about tests, would have gotten into the best schools, and landed the best jobs. Of course, Lady Scroll doesn't quite get the prince's comment and assumes he must have been tested in the royal court. The prince quickly agrees, as he does not want to expose his true identity. Lady Scroll then explains that memorizing everything isn't always the best approach. Sometimes, it's better to let go of things, and she always has to keep those bad memories, even though she wants to just forget them. The prince reflects on this, and he feels quite sad for her as he agrees that she is absolutely right. It does not take her long to notice that the prince is feeling quite down because of her, so she reassures him, saying she's doing fine, and that everything is in the past already. She then begins to think to herself how Roland Wimbledon is unlike any elite she's ever encountered. Despite his vast knowledge, all he seems concerned about is passing it on to others. He doesn't act superior, even though he's in a position of power. Meanwhile, the prince decides to call it a day. Lady Scroll asks if he plans to continue this tomorrow. The prince happily says no and tells her to give Kyle Sitchy the notes along with a physics textbook, as it'll keep him busy for a while. Later, we find ourselves by a pond. The fish happily begin munching on the dead skin of Lady Leaf as she dips her feet into the water. Sister Scroll also joins the scene and asks her friend if her feet are feeling okay. Lady Leaf responds that her toes are in great shape now and she doesn't have to worry about them freezing in the coming winter. Lady Scroll then looks around at the lush greenery and asks her friend if she planted all these plants. The green girl nods, saying those are grapevines, fruit trees, and crops. She also mentions that there are lots of bird nests in the area and that Honey's messenger pigeon lives there. Lady Leaf then explains that the prince always told her that evolution lies in a witch's understanding of their power. She finds plant cells fascinating and initially thought they should function as a single unit. She points out how a bunch of leaves can become a vine, and if they're all different, they can never combine into one. She reflects on how her powers are tied to the ecosystem itself. Looking at her thriving green garden, with birds living and flourishing, she feels that she's found her path forward.